Hello everyone, this is Brian at F Studios, and this is another edition of Inside the Studio with Brian F. So what do we want to talk about today? Well, actually, today I want to talk to you guys about a recent project I helped out with for a local Pacific Northwest black metal group, Sacrament of Impurity. Now, Sacrament approached me a little while ago asking if I might be interested in recording them for their, I think it's either their third or fourth full-length album release entitled The Purest of Sins. And I think by the time this video gets out, the album itself should be released and ready for sale for anybody who's actually interested in purchasing it. So hopefully me putting this video together for you guys out there won't be stepping on anybody's toes in the meantime. Anyway, the guys approached me because they wanted to try something different from what they've usually done. I think they said they did a couple albums at another local studio, and you know, they were happy with how things were for the most part, but they wanted to try something different to get a slightly different sound, I guess. More of a natural sound of who they really were. Because their past few albums, the recording engineer, the guy who helped produce them and whatnot, he did a lot of the same things that I hear a lot of other engineers always do in cases of bands or groups that are doing extreme metal. Where they're triggering the drums and whatnot to get a better sounding recording or whatnot. So when they mix everything, it sounds pretty good, right? I've always kind of been against doing that. This band I brought in, it was the first band that I've ever recorded that was in a category that would be classified as extreme metal. And I really didn't think there'd be any kind of a problem except for the same things that other engineers will kind of gripe about. I wasn't really too concerned about the recording process itself, because since these guys were only booking 2 days, they just wanted to get something quick and dirty done and then go ahead and mix it themselves. So we set it up so they could do that. We close mic'd the entire kit, and the kit is somewhat like mine. Now my kit is just a 5-piece set, and it's maybe put together a little bit differently than Sacrament of Impurity's drum kit. But their kit was pretty much the same. 4-tom snare, bigger kick than mine, and a hell of a lot more cymbals and more hi-hats. Well, not more hi-hats, but just different placement for the hi-hat. And as you can see, what I do is I'll put the mic pretty close on all my toms and my snare. And the toms are usually pretty consistent when it comes to 4-tom mic placement. But depending on how I got my cymbals set at the time, I might change the arrangement of the mics on the top toms. And the snare mic is usually pretty consistent. I like putting the snare mic where it is because with the dynamic microphones, these are unidirectional microphones, having this placed nearly 180 degrees off axis from the hi-hat gives me as much elimination as possible from excess spillage from the hi-hat through the snare. However, when it came to Sacrament of Impurity's drum kit, setting up the mic here interfered with how their drummer played. He was just too concerned about he might hit it, and it really just fucked things over. I wasn't able to put this on a boom and come in underneath like you see at a lot of other studios, because the placement he had of all the other equipment, the other cymbals and the hi-hat, made it impossible for me to get a nice fit in there without anything possibly vibrating or hitting the microphone or the boom stand at some point. So we had to compromise, at which point we ended up coming through as 2 rack toms, which the 2 high ones were actually offset over here. And so we came right in between this way into the center position of the snare and set up there, which worked out great for the recording, for how he played. But now I'm only 90 degrees off axis from the hi-hat, therefore allowing more spill to come through the snare mic. So with that kind of setup, the only thing I really got concerned about was how much spillage from the hi-hat was going to come through the snare mic itself, because honestly, I would like to keep a nice stereo separation from all the cymbals and the hi-hat, so you got a nice pan from left to right. And I was only using 2 overhead microphones to capture the cymbals themselves. I wasn't using overheads to capture the natural sound of the entire drum kit. That was not their purpose in this recording. It's close mic on the drums, close mic just in front of the bass drum, and then 2 overheads just for the cymbals. So during mixing, I would eliminate virtually the rest of the tone of the drums coming through the overheads by using high-pass filters, and then EQing as necessary to help the cymbals stand out a bit. The recording process itself was pretty much straightforward, really easy, no worries about any of it. It's just set it up, got it done, and then sat down for 10 hours and recorded the guys. And over the course of a day and a half, actually, about, I'd say total time was probably only 15 hours, if that. But we did it over the course of a day and a half. But 15 hours of recording, they got a whole hour's worth of music done on 16 tracks, plus, because some tracks they wanted to do some things that they couldn't do live on the fly as smoothly as they want it to be on the album. So when it came to mixing, I had an idea of where I wanted to go and how I was going to do it, but ultimately I wouldn't know exactly what I could do until I started hearing the results. So using the first track we recorded, I got everything set up for the mix. The dynamics, processing, the panning, and the EQ, and got it all good to go. And ultimately though, I did not really like the way things were happening with the snare and the hi-hat, particularly coming through the snare channel. For example, now this is how I originally mixed the drums. And for the most part, everything sounds pretty good. Not too bad, not too soft. It seems to have a nice balance. But if you didn't notice, the hi-hat is coming through the snare mic, in my opinion, just too strongly. And I really didn't want that, but I felt at the time, you know what, this is probably the best it's going to be, so we're just going to go for it. So as you were able to hear from that particular mix, just for those few seconds, the overall sound of the drums themselves weren't really all that bad, but we heard quite a bit of spillage from the hi-hat coming into the snare mic, because there was just the certain frequency, mid-range frequency of the hi-hat in the snare that was completely different from what we were picking up through the overheads. And that in itself is a problem, but it wasn't the only thing that lent itself to being a problem. One of the bigger issues was during blast beat sessions, where when Sam Hain went into blast beats, he would quiet down quite a bit as far as the amount of power he was using on the snare. But the hi-hat didn't seem to change much. And to get the level of the snare to get back up to where it was during more normal playing, I had to really push the fader up high in relation to the rest of the kit that was playing back. And in doing so, it really made the hi-hat overbearing. You didn't hear any of the hi-hat come through the overheads, and it was just so much louder than everything else in its frequency range. It just became ridiculous. And I'll see if I can I'll show you an example of that here right now. So maybe this will help give you an idea of the situation I was having. Doesn't sound too bad by itself, but notice I had to turn the volume up quite a bit on the snare channel here compared to where it was before, and in relation to the rest of the kit. And if I turn on the rest of the music, the drums get buried in the mix. They get lost. And I really couldn't get rid of that problem with the snare itself unless I continued to boost up the output of not only the channel here, but the dynamics processor, the compressor. And in doing so, it just made that hi-hat too glaringly awful. So ultimately, in my opinion, after spending for, I think it was 8 hours overall, mixing the album for the first time, that the mix, especially for the drums themselves, with the hi-hat coming through like it was in the snare channel, was just not usable. It was not appropriate. I also didn't like the fact that the tone of the snare and the attack that it had changed so much between where Samhain was playing more traditional style to when he was doing a blast beat. I mean, you can obviously tell that he was hitting the snare much lighter, and it just doesn't create a cohesive sound for the track. It would be something different if the rest of the instruments toned that down as well and became quieter and softer and whatnot, but not in the case of when everything else is still just blaringly strong and powerful and loud. I spent, like I said, about 8 hours, maybe 10 hours mixing the whole album, and then there's the process of still just listening to it and getting a feel for it and thinking, well, what can I do to make this thing sound better? How do I get rid of the hi-hat in the snare channel? Well, the first thought is use a gate, right? Throw a gate on there and everything will be great. Well, that's not necessarily true. I even played with the gate just to see if I could make it work, and it wouldn't. The reason being is that during standard drum sessions throughout the track, the gate could be set up pretty well to where you could get rid of the hi-hat altogether. And you could set the decay of the gate and where it starts cutting off at, and you got a good sound. But as soon as you went into blast beats, that setting didn't work anymore. So you could try to argue that, well, you just have to use automation and change the settings of the gate for blast beat sections of the song. But here's the problem. There was only about a 6 dB difference between the amount of signal coming through the snare mic from the hi-hat and the actual snare hit. That 6 dB of difference wasn't enough to set up the gate properly to get a good sound from the snare and have it transition to where the gate's closed without sounding completely unnatural at that point. So the gate by itself is out. At the same time, I also wanted to be able to compress the sound, but I couldn't set the compressor so low or have the threshold set so low that it would act at the volume levels of the snare during blast beats and still sound decent while Samhain was playing more traditional drumming styles, where he's playing heavier and louder. And again, you can argue automation, but I wanted a better approach. I wanted something simpler. I wanted an approach that was going to help me get a compressed sound on the snare, that it was going to boost the signal on the snare so I didn't have to compress it so hard through all the different sections, and something that would help me gate out the hi-hat. And I kind of sat on that for a few days, and eventually it just popped in my head. It's something I hadn't done for a few years, and that was to use a Compander. I put it on and I set it up and it almost worked. It still wasn't quite there. Something else needed to be done. And here's what it was. Here's what happened. Now, this is the snare's EQ curve. And as you can see here, it didn't really take a lot to get it to sound decent. We just kind of cut out a little bit here, centering at the 630 hertz point with only a 0.7 Q. And then I originally gave a little bit of a boost at the 4K. But it really isn't necessary. All this frequency range here has no purpose when you throw in the rest of the music and the rest of the drum mics as they're coming through, you can make up whatever you're getting in here through the other mics, and the signal itself is so low because where the snare resonates at is actually down in here. All this really becomes unnecessary and you don't hear it anyway in the rest of the mix. So I want to know, where was the hi-hat sitting in the curve here? And figured the only way to find that out is to put a low pass filter on it and just kind of adjust it down and see how far it took to get it to go away. So here's the EQ setup. I've got the low pass filter set all the way to 20.1 kilohertz, and I've turned the dynamics off so we don't hear the effect they're having on it right now. This is the snare itself during blast beat sessions, and we're going to figure out just where we can cut out the frequencies to get rid of the hi-hat as much as possible. So here we go. Alright, you heard it right there. As soon as I started to get around the 3 kilohertz mark and drop below, the amount of signal from the hi-hat coming through the snare was all but gone. So that turned out being exactly what I needed to try and get the hi-hat out of the snare as much as possible, and then I was able to use the Compander to set the decay rate to be able to blend what was left of the hi-hat signal with the natural decay rate of the snare's resonance, and I was able to blend it all in to get a really nice sound. Let me show you a little bit of the settings of the Compander. Now, I had the Compander set up pretty much just like a hard compressor with a quick gate. Now what you can see here, I got the compressor set to 20:1, which is as close to being a limiter as possible with the Compander setup. And I got the threshold down to negative 25 dB to activate, and I gave it just a little bit of a width of 1 dB with a release time of 110 milliseconds. What that does helps to expand just enough to keep the blast beats up into a higher decibel range than what they normally would be, and then the release allows it to decay at a rate that's quick enough it can get rid of a lot of the hi-hat that we would still normally hear. Now let me see if I can get an example of how it's all working. As you heard, as I opened up the width on the Compander, a lot more of the rest of the kit was bleeding into the snare channel. We heard a lot more of the cymbals, a lot more of the toms, a lot more of the kick, and a lot more of the unwanted hi-hat. So it allowed me to set the sound up in a manner that when all the rest of the instruments are playing and all the rest of the drum channels are opened, to get a really natural sounding snare, compressed snare, without allowing a lot of the bleed into the rest of the channel. Overall, I think it took probably another 3-4 hours to do for the whole album. And then at that point, the basic mix was done. And once I went through the whole album, got it mixed and sounding pretty good how I wanted it set up, that's when I submixed it down to 2 channels, and then I loaded it back into the AW4416, and I used the machine as a mastering device then. And I ran a basic compressor on it that the machine has, except I set it up as a hard limiter. And I squashed it all the way down to where we were just above where the guitar levels were, I think, which is about negative 10 dB. and then I boosted the output -10 dB. So I thought that would be the point at which I could just master it at and, live with those levels. I'm not going to try to get any hotter. There ended up being an issue that I found while I was going through that mastering process. And it turned out on one of the tracks, just one of the floor tom hits made the compressor compress so hard you could audibly hear all the other instruments within the stereo track just squash down. And we couldn't have that. So the second stage in the mastering process then stopped from placing a limiter on the tracks and getting the volume up. Instead, I set the machine up as a multi-band compressor and then set up just a mild compression on the low end. That one little bit of a little bit of extra compression just on the low frequencies made it so that when I did come back for the third time through and put the limiter on the overall stereo, the submix stereo channels, that problem disappeared. So to make the whole album consistent, every track ran through the machine while it was set up as a multi-band compressor, so that everything had a consistent sound. So I ended up submixing it down onto cassette, running chrome tapes, high speed, with a DDX Type 2 noise reduction turned on. After that, I played it back and recorded on this machine using the analog EQ system by cutting a little bit of the low mids and boosting the highs and the lows just enough to bring it back around to where the original sound out of the machine here, out of the original recordings was. And then I ran it through an 8th exciter to give it a little more brightness, a little more crispness to the very high end where the cymbals would sit, that might have been lost on the tape itself, regardless of what I had tried to do. In my opinion, the thing sounds great. It's big, it's powerful, it's loud, it's aggressive, and it's very intense. And right now, I'm actually going to share with you guys a completed mix of one of the tracks that I've done on this album. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. If you do have any questions, just send me an email or send me a message or whatever, and I'll try to address them on the next show. Thanks for watching. This is Inside the Studio with Brian F. And this is Sacrament of Impurity from the album Purest of Sins.